Hello everybody, welcome to Ms. McGuire online video lecture, and today we're covering the anatomy of urinary system. So let's go ahead and begin. Organs of the urinary system includes kidneys that are the major excretory organs, and organs that assist kidneys in their function. And those organs include urinary bladder, that is the temporary storage reservoir for urine, ureters that transport urine from the kidney to the bladder, and urethra transports urine out of the body. So major organs are kidneys, and then supporting organs for transportation and temporary storage of urine, urinary bladder, ureters, and urethra. So here's the anatomy diagram that show us where kidneys and other organs are located. So we have right and left kidney that located in the abdominal region. Kidneys are retroperitoneal. That means they are in abdominal cavity, but they're not in peritoneal cavity. Superior and medial to kidneys, you see adrenal glands. You also see blood vessels that deliver blood to the kidneys. Those are renal arteries. Then your kidneys clean your blood, filter out different molecules and ions, maybe toxins from your blood. They filter it out, clean your blood, and this filtrate became urine, and urine travel inside ureters to the bladder, urinary bladder, and clean blood returns back to the inferior vena cava through renal veins. Right, so over here you can see the urinary bladder and urethra. Now this is female anatomy, so posterior to urinary bladder we can see uterus, and posterior to uterus is rectum. Kidney functions: removal of toxins, metabolic waste, and excess ions from the blood. Regulation of blood volume, chemical composition, and pH. Gluconeogenesis during prolonged fasting. And this terms means genesis, generation of glucose. And because it's neogenesis, that means your cells make glucose from, not from carbohydrates, not from glycogen. Endocrine function. Your kidneys secrete renin for regulation of blood pressure and kidney function, and erythropoietin, regulation of red blood cells production. And another function is activation of vitamin D. Kidneys are retroperitoneal. They are in the superior lumbar region. Right kidney is lower than left kidney. So that's actually posterior view. And this will be right kidney in this example. So you can see it's a little bit lower than left kidneys because we have a large organ over here, liver. And because liver takes lots of space, the kidney a little bit lower than another one. A convex lateral surface, so that's convex, and concave medial surface, that concave surface. Ureters, renal blood vessels, lymphatics, and nerves enter and exit at structure called hilum. So the hilum will be structure right there. Okay, so this is kidney anatomy. Layer of supportive tissue include renal fascia, perirenal fat capsule, and fibrous capsule. So the fibrous capsule is covering the, so let's start with renal fascia. if you look at this cross section, that's anterior view right there, and posterior view. That's our peritoneal cavities. And you can see kidneys are retroperitoneal, so they are not inside this peritoneal membrane. So, so first we're gonna start with renal fascia, right? So here's the covering, connective tissue covering, anterior renal fascia and posterior renal fascia. Then we have perirenal fat capsule, so fat, and fibrous capsule on the surface of the kidney. So renal fascia, the anchoring outer layer of dense fibrous connective tissue. Perirenal fat capsule is a fatty cushion, and fibrous capsule is the deepest layer of those coverings that prevents spread of infection to kidney. Internal anatomy of the kidney. Kidney is made of a renal cortex, so this area over here, right? The outer layer, right? Sorry, that's renal cortex. It's a granular superficial region. So you actually would see like lots of granules inside the cortex. Then renal medulla, so that's a renal medulla. Right there. The cone-shaped medullary renal pyramids separated by renal columns. So medulla includes pyramids. So here's a pyramid. Here's another pyramid called renal pyramids. And this tissue between pyramids called renal columns. Now lobe, a medullary pyramid and its surrounding cortical tissue. So if you would divide kidney into lobes, you would cut in the middle of renal column, right, to the cortex, include a pyramid and half of another column. So that's one lobe. So another lobe, so maybe I will show you on this. So we will include this pyramid. We will cut in the middle of column, include the cortex, right? And half of another column. So that's gonna be our one lobe. Now papilla is a tip of pyramid that releases urine into minor calyx. So this structure is a tube, look like a cup. This is called minor calyx. Now, when we have 2 or 3 calyces that join together, we form major calyx. So this is going to be a major calyx. So you see here is one minor calyx, another minor calyx. When they comes together, that's our major calyx. Sometimes we might have 2 or 3 minor calyces that form major calyx. And the renal pelvis is a funnel-shaped tube within the renal sinus. Now, this area where you see blood vessels called renal sinus, and this part is renal pelvis. So major calyces brings urine to the pelvis. So I would say this is number 5 here, you see, that's a minor calyx. And I believe number 4, that's a renal pelvis. I don't know why it's a little bit on the side, but if you put it right here in the middle, that would be renal pelvis. So minor calyces surround the apex of the renal pyramid. So here's our apex, and minor calyces surrounds it. Urine formed in the kidney passes through a renal papilla at the apex into the minor calyx. Major calyces collect urine from minor calyces and empty urine into the pelvis. Urine flows from the pelvis to ureter. So here's the pelvis, and then urine flows into ureter. So on this diagram, we can see the real kidney and a diagram like cartoon picture. So So you see renal cortex, renal medulla. Inside the renal medulla, you have renal pyramids, minor calyx. So that's a minor calyx. Oh, that's already major calyx. Sorry. So here's a minor calyx, another minor. That's a major calyx, renal pelvis, and ureter. So this is renal columns over here between pyramids. Now, what is nephron? So nephron is a structural and functional units that form urine. It's about 1 million per kidney. And nephron has two main parts. First is glomerulus, that is a tuft of capillaries. And second part, renal tubules. Begins at a cup-shaped glomerular capsule surrounding the glomerulus. So on this diagram here, if you look at the renal cortex, you will see these circular structures. Now, those circular structure called glomerular corpuscle. Yeah, it says glomerular capsule, but that's a glomerulus are those capillaries inside. So we have glomerulus, we have glomerular capsule, and these two structures together are called corpuscle. So now you see those corpuscles, renal corpuscles. Sorry, did I say glomerular corpuscle? It's renal corpuscle. So renal corpuscle, let me see if it's on the next slide. Yes, it's right there. So let's look over here first. So renal corpuscle is glomerulus and its glomerular capsule. So this entire structure called renal corpuscle that is made of two parts. Those blood vessels, those capillaries inside is glomerulus and its own glomerular capsule. All right, so now I will go back. So here we see renal corpuscles, right, in the renal cortex, then tubules going from this corpuscle. Now, these tubules that close to the glomerular capsule is called proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal because it's close to the corpuscle, and convoluted because it has this zigzag shape. It's not straight tube. Then it goes down, the tube goes down and goes up, and this is called loop of Henle or loop of nephron. And then it became convoluted again. It's a distal convoluted tubule. And up to this point, right, so it's so we have glomerulus, glomerular capsule, and all these tubules form nephron. And this is nephron that form urine. Now, several nephrons gonna bring urine inside this bigger tube called collecting duct. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. So on this slide, you can see parts of a nephron. Right, so here we have our glomerulus, then glomerular capsule. So together they make renal corpuscle. We have proximal convoluted tubule. We have loop of Henle or loop of nephron that includes a thin segment in a descending limb, and then ascending limb has a thick segment. Then we have a distal convoluted tubule that brings urine to collecting duct. Now, we cannot include collecting duct into nephron. So collecting duct is not part of a nephron because several nephrons gonna bring urine to one collecting duct. Also, what you can see here is that we deliver oxygenated blood to this renal corpuscle, right? And then the blood vessels split into capillaries, and this is where we have filtration of blood. So nephron made of renal corpuscle. We already said that is made of glomerulus and it's glomerular capsule. Now, glomerulus, those are fenestrated capillaries. So fenestrated glomerular endothelium allows filtrate to pass from plasma into glomerular capsule. So now imagine the blood flows through these blood vessels, number 6, called efferent arteriole, and it enters those very porous capillaries. Now, filtrate from blood gonna flow out of these capillaries inside the capsule. And then filtrate flows into tubules, starting with proximal convoluted tubule. But of course, not everything leaks out, right? Some blood stays inside capillaries and it flows away from glomerulus through this blood vessel, number 7, that called efferent arteriole. So glomerular capsule made of parietal layer that is simple squamous epithelium and visceral layer, branching epithelial podocytes. Filtration slits allow filtrate to pass into the capsular space. So you see those structures shown on the surface of the glomerulus. It's actually this visceral layer. So you see this cell called podocyte. Then we have basement membrane, and then our endothelium. Right. So capillary is made of endothelium. Endothelium is type of epithelial tissue, so we always have basement membrane if we have epithelial tissue, and then we have this podocyte, and that's our visceral layer. The parietal layer are those cells that make a capsule itself, right? So it's a simple squamous epithelium. Then we have proximal convoluted tubule, or PCT, that made is cuboidal cells with dense microvilli and large mitochondria. So this is how this tube is made of. It's made of cuboidal, simple cuboidal epithelium with multiple mitochondria and microvilli, function in reabsorption and secretion, and continued to the confined to cortex. So this is found in cortex, renal cortex, not in the medulla. Now, I forgot to tell you then in glomerular capsule, right? So we have glomerulus and its capsule, renal corpuscle. This is where we have filtration. Yeah, it actually says filtration slits, but that's the process that happens in this part of nephron is called filtration. In the proximal convoluted tubule, we have reabsorption and secretion. And reabsorption means the substances inside this tubule in the filtrate return back to blood. That's reabsorption. And secretion is some of the substances in the blood secretes inside the tubules. Now, loop of Henle has, loop of Henle has descending and ascending limbs. Thin segment usually in descending limb. So here we go down, that is descending, and we have thin segment made of simple squamous epithelium tissue and freely permeable to water. So the water will flow in and out, so it's permeable to water. Thick segment of ascending limb made of a cuboidal, from cuboidal to columnar cells, and it's not permeable to water. After loop of nephron or loop of Henle, we have DCT, or distal convoluted tubule, made of cuboidal cells with very few microvilli. So here we have cuboidal again, but not that many microvilli compared to the proximal convoluted tubule. Function more in secretion than reabsorption. So again, secretion when substances from blood moves inside the tube, and it's confined to the cortex as well. So in the cortex, we will have renal corpuscle and proximal and distal convoluted tubule. And loop of Henle we will find in medulla of kidney. Collecting ducts receive filtrate from many nephrons, fuse together to deliver urine through papillae into minor calyces. So here's our collecting duct. Cell types. We have two major cell types: intercalated cells, that cuboidal cells with microvilli, so right there, function in maintaining acid-base balance of the body, and principal cells, that is cuboidal cells without microvilli, and help maintain the body's water and salt balance. So more numerous are principal cells for water and salt balance, and less numerous intercalated cells for acid, base, or pH balance. Right, so here's kind of summary, sorry, that tells you histology of nephron. So here's glomerular capsule, the capsule itself, simple squamous, then glomerulus visceral layer made of simple squamous endothelium and podocytes, proximal convoluted tubule, simple cuboidal with multiple microvilli, many mitochondria, distal convoluted tubule, simple cuboidal with fewer mitochondria and fewer microvilli, loop of Henle if it's a thin segment, that is simple simple squamous. If it's a thick segment, it can be simple cuboidal or simple columnar even, and collecting duct, a simple cuboidal with two cells, principal cells and intercalated cells. Now, when we look at nephrons, we have two types of nephrons: cortical nephrons and juxtamedullary nephrons. Most of nephrons are cortical. 85% of nephrons almost entirely in cortex. So if you look at this diagram here, cortex on top and medulla on the bottom, and for example, this nephron is almost entirely inside the cortex. But look at this nephron. Now, the proximal and distal convoluted tubule and renal corpuscle are still in cortex, but loop of Henle is very long and it goes down to a medulla. That's called, this nephron is called juxtamedullary nephron. So it has long loops of Henle, deeply invade the medulla, extensive thin segment, and they are important in production of concentrated urine. Now, renal nephrons, their major function is filtration and cleaning of blood, and juxtamedullary nephron, important in the production of concentrated or diluted urine. Okay, now glomerulus is actually a fancy name for capillaries. But before we get to the capillaries, we need a bigger blood vessel. So it's going to be afferent arteriole. So afferent arteriole enters the capsule, splits into smaller blood vessels, capillaries or glomerulus, and then capillaries unite again into efferent arteriole. All right, but glomerulus specialized for filtration. Blood pressure is high in glomerulus because efferent arterioles are smaller in diameter than afferent arterioles. And Arterioles are high resistance vessels. Now, the afferent, the one that enters the capsule, is large in the diameter, and then you go from larger diameter to smaller diameter. Of course, the blood pressure would be higher than in regular capillaries. Peritubular capillaries. Now, how peritubular capillaries form? So when we have our afferent arteriole enters the capsule, forms glomerulus, then capillaries unite, making efferent arteriole, then efferent arteriole splits again into capillaries. When we have two capillary beds in a row, we call it portal system. So in your kidneys, you have portal systems. So we split into capillaries twice. Now, those peritubular capillaries, they are low pressure, porous capillaries adapted for absorption, arise from efferent arterioles, cling to adjacent renal tubules. So they really kind of surround all these tubules in cortex and empty into venules. So when they empty into venules, then venules unite to form bigger veins. Vasa recta. Those are long vessels parallel to long loops of Henle. So this is our cortical nephron. Remember that it's almost completely inside cortex, and we have peritubular capillaries. Now this juxtamedullary nephrons with the long loop of Henle, they have this blood vessel that parallel to this loop, and this is called vasa recta. So it arises from efferent arterioles of juxtaglomerular nephrons and function in formation of concentrated urine. Now let's look at blood supply of the kidneys. Of course, we have renal arteries that branch from abdominal aorta. So here's our abdominal aorta, and here's the left and right renal arteries shown here in red. So they deliver 1/4 or 1,200 milliliters of cardiac output to the kidney each minute. So you can see the blood flow to the kidney is very extensive, like lots of blood flow to the kidneys. Every minute you have 1,200 milliliters. So it's more than a liter of blood. Arterial flow into and venous flow out of kidney follows similar pattern. So the blood flow to the kidneys, right, and then returns back, and the pattern is similar. And that means that name of the blood vessels, arteries and veins are similar too. Nerve supply via sympathetic fibers from the renal plexus. And sympathetic means your fight or flight response, right? So it's your sympathetic nervous system supply nerves to the kidney and regulate their function. Now let's look at the bigger blood vessels and how we get from aorta to inferior vena cava. Right, so we're gonna bring blood to the kidneys, right? So from aorta, we will have renal arteries that branch from aorta. After that, renal arteries have some segments over here. So they branch into segments, and it's called segmental artery. Now, then segmental artery moves toward the cortex, and it's actually located between lobes of kidney. So it's between lobes of kidney, then it's called interlobar, so it's between lobes. Then arteries make like these arches on a border between cortex and medulla, and we call them arcuate artery. And then we have arteries radiating from arcuate. Those are cortical radiate, right? So we have, again, we have renal artery, segmental artery, interlobar artery, arcuate artery, cortical radiate arteries. Now here's our cortical radiate artery, and we have afferent arteriole, right? Afferent arteriole. that split into capillaries called glomerulus. Then those capillaries unite, forming efferent arteriole. Efferent arteriole branch again into peritubular capillaries and vasa recta, and then bring blood, collect blood to the cortical radiate vein. You see, we have cortical radiate artery and cortical radiate vein, so they radiate from arcuate vein, right? So we have arcuate vein, we have interlobar vein, renal vein, and inferior vena cava. So you can see that segmental artery exists, but we don't have segmental vein. But the rest of the names are the same. Renal artery, renal vein, interlobar artery, interlobar vein, arcuate artery, arcuate vein, cortical radiate artery, cortical radiate vein. And what's shown over here in this rectangle, inside this rectangle, that's a smaller blood vessel that enter glomerular capsule, right? Leave glomerular capsule, surround tubules of nephron, right? And then we unite them into venules. Now, what is JGA? It's juxtaglomerular apparatus. It's a very special structure, one per nephron. This apparatus is important in regulation of filtrate formation and blood pressure. It involves modified portion of a distal portion of the ascending limb of the loop of Henle and efferent, sometimes efferent arteriole. So this is our Bowman's capsule or glomerular capsule. Remember, that's our glomerulus. So here's our efferent arteriole. So the blood flow toward the nephron. All right, so the part of this efferent arteriole, sometimes this efferent arteriole and our loop of Henle, in some books, instead of loop of Henle, you will see that it's called the distal convoluted tubule. So it's a distal convoluted tubule or loop of Henle. I guess both can be a part of this apparatus. And what this apparatus is, it just cells. See cells shown here in green, cells shown here in pink. Now those cells that are green, called granular cells, because they have granules. And these cells in a distal convoluted tubule called macula densa. And macula means spot, and densa is dense. So it's a dense spot over here. So here's our granular cells. They have a different name, like juxtaglomerular or JG cells. I like to call them granular because it gives me kind of like a visual representation of those cells. They are enlarged, smooth muscle cells of arteriole, and they have secretory granules that contain renin. Renin is endocrine hormone that you release when your blood pressure drops. And those granular cells, they are Micana receptors that sense blood pressure. So when blood pressure is really high, it will put force on the vessels of the efferent arteriole, and it will activate these granular cells. Those receptors tell you the blood pressure is high, or when blood pressure is low, they will sense that blood pressure is low. A macula densa are tall, closely packed cells in the ascending limb, and they are chemoreceptors that sense sodium chloride concentrate of filtrate. Right, so we have the blood enters glomerulus, right, and you have these granular cells that are Micana receptors, so they will detect blood pressure. Then, of course, you're going to filtrate your blood, right? It will go to the proximal convoluted tubule, distal convoluted tubule, that loop of Henle. And when you're coming back from this loop of Henle over here, now it's a time to see, like, okay, well, how much sodium chloride is there? So how much water your kidneys actually either gonna remove from your body, right, in the form of urine, how much sodium chloride will be removed. So that's very important for proper function of kidney, to have receptors that can inform your body about amount of sodium chloride in the filtrate that going to be your urine, right? So you can adjust it if needed. Okay, now what is filtration membrane? It's a porous membrane between the blood and the capsular space of glomerular capsule. Let's look at the diagram over here. I hope you already recognize those parts. So we have a larger blood vessels called afferent arteriole, right? And here's your blood flow inside this arteriole. And your blood, of course, is made of plasma and formed elements, so cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. But in the plasma, you will have different solutes and proteins, right? So they show here in the small blue dots and the proteins in the bigger green dots. So when the blood flows into glomerulus, remember glomerulus is fenestrated, it's very porous. Lots of this water of the plasma and solutes, those substances that dissolve in water, they filter out. They filter out inside this capsule. Now, what exactly they need to pass through, right? So you're moving from a blood vessel inside the tubule. It's like you're moving from one room to, I don't know, through the kitchen, to the your entrance door and outside your house, right? So if you take this analogy, you're sitting in your study room where you study biology, then you need to get up and you need to move through your kitchen to your living room and then outside of your house. Imagine this, right? So you need to pass through several structures. The same, these solutes and water, it's gonna pass through filtration membrane. And filtration membrane consists of fenestrated endothelium of glomerular capsule. So here's our capsule, right? The capsule itself. So we have. So let's start with the capillaries, right? So that's a glomerulus, right? So glomerulus has capillary endothelium. So that's our endothelium. It's fenestrated because you see how it has this big pores. So that's endothelium of the glomerular capsule, fenestrated endothelium. Then we have the visceral membrane of glomerular capsule, podocytes with food processes and filtration slits. So then we have these podocytes. And between them, we have gel-like basement membrane that fused basal lamina of two other layers, right? So we have capillaries, right? So we have capillaries. Capillaries have wall, and those walls are made of endothelium. Then you have wall of the capsule, and it's made of the food processes of podocytes of glomerular capsule. And between them, you have extracellular structure called basement membrane. So those are three parts of the filtration membrane. So filtration membrane allows passage of water and solutes smaller than most plasma proteins. They prevent filtration of blood cells, and negatively charged basement membrane repels large anions such as plasma proteins. Right, so would it tell us that if we return back to this diagram, we know if we would just have, for example, that would of course never happen. But let's imagine we have this blood vessel and it kind of like ends over here, right? And everything would leak out, right? We don't want it to happen. We don't want these large proteins leave your bloodstream. We don't want your red blood cells leave your bloodstream, because what's going to happen if your red blood cells penetrate your glomerular wall? Then you will pee blood, right? So your blood going to be full of red blood cells. So that's going to be blood in your urine. I'm sorry, your blood, your urine, right? So okay, so here's your blood, right? So your point is to remove water and solutes, soluble substances from your blood, but prevent proteins and cells leaving your blood. That makes sense? That's why we have this filtration memory. So the small particles, they can move through this memory, but the large particles, like your proteins or red blood cells or white blood cells, they cannot move through filtration membrane. And if they cannot move through filtration membrane, they cannot be in your filtrate. And if they are not in your filtrate, then they are not in your urine, right? That makes sense? Okay, so I'm going to stop over here, and then I will record another video to cover the rest of the organs of the urinary system. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope it was helpful.